And there is breaking news at that chemical plant in Crosby, Texas. Chris Van Cleve is there. Chris?
DeMarco, we are more than a mile from the plant. You can see the plume of black smoke. We can see the fire from here. We understand it is a very intensely burning blaze. At least 2 of 8 remaining tractor trailers that contain organic peroxide have exploded. This was expected when the refrigeration units quit during 4 to 6 feet of flooding. The chemical plant knew this was going to happen. They said it could happen at any moment, and late this afternoon it did. Yesterday, one of these trailers went up. Now at least 2 of them have exploded. This is an intense, big fire. This chemical plant has a host of potentially very dangerous chemicals.
The Arkema chemical plant in Crosby, Texas experienced between 4 and 6 feet of flooding during Hurricane Harvey in August of 2017. This plant was used to create organic peroxides that go on to make many of the plastics that we use every day, such as styrofoam cups. These chemicals have to be stored at cool temperatures in ventilated areas away from heat sources because they are very unstable. These chemicals can be corrosive and toxic and cause irritation to the skin and long-term harm to the body depending on the dose.
When the flooding started, workers rushed to move the chemicals from their cooling warehouses to refrigerator trucks when the generators ultimately failed. Though they moved the chemicals, the truck's systems failed, causing the chemicals to rapidly heat and eventually combust. When the plant knew they had to abandon the peroxides, they set up a 1.5-mile perimeter and called first responders to control the fire. Those first responders later reported health issues after turning to the blaze.
The facility was found to be in both the 100 and 500-year floodplain zones, but found themselves relying on employee memory of past flooding events to assess future flood risk. Due to this, the precautions that they thought they had in place all failed due to flooding. It was deemed that Arkema had insufficient protective action in place in multiple regards. First being, the power transformers were not high enough off the ground, and second being that a container of toxic isobutylene was located within close proximity to the trailers storing the chemicals. This is the aftermath of just one incident that has already occurred, but the frequency of these types of events will likely increase due to climate change and more frequent flooding events, as well as the intensification of these flooding events. The Arkema plant in Texas is just one of thousands of chemical plants in flood-prone areas across the country. With sea level rise on the horizon, the risk calculations for these sites will have to be reevaluated. At this rate, more and more chemical plants will be put at greater and greater risk of flood-induced accidents such as the one experienced at Arkema's plant. To put this into perspective, Arkema is actually at a very low risk of flooding compared to many of these other plants on the Gulf Coast. The lightest shade of red on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's map represents those who are least susceptible. The Arkema plant lies in this lightest color. With plants at low flood risk being destroyed by such events during a disaster, the possibility of increasingly intense hurricane activity with climate change, mixed with the rising risk of inland flooding, people in the environment are at incredible levels of exposure risk from toxic pollutants.
When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, multiple hazardous waste sites, storage facilities, and hazardous waste handlers were in the flooded areas. There were reports of fuels, industrial chemicals, and sewage spilled. When the soil testing occurred later in the city, researchers found lead, arsenic, and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, all of which are toxic to human health. For arsenic specifically, all 7 neighborhoods tested had higher levels than Louisiana's recommended action level. These sources of pollution range from the arsenic-treated wood, to pesticides, to trash incineration, to industrial leakage. The long-term impacts from these types of events led to soil that is toxic to people who have home gardens with plants that absorb these types of chemicals. For children, these chemicals can lead to serious developmental defects. Because the pollutants originated from so many sources and industries, it's hard to assign blame to fund necessary remediation practices.
Rather than assigning blame after the fact, there should be an increased emphasis on regulations regarding preparedness rather than costly and timely cleanup operations. The Arkema plant is just one more recent example of a potential lack of preparedness on behalf of the chemical industry. If change doesn't happen, more and more cities in flood-prone areas will see long-term environmental damage, as well as detrimental human health effects.